We are back. You are chatting with John P. Today, we are going to be switching it up a little bit and talking about watch brand stereotypes. Now, this is something that typically, when people get really serious about, I kind of like to laugh and, make sure to kind of reiterate that we're all in this. We're all watch collectors. We all like certain things. Some things maybe we don't prefer or it's not what we enjoy the most. But that's the great thing about watches is that there are so many watches and you never know which watch may pop up in the future from a brand that you thought was not for you. And then you're just drawn to it for whatever reason. And actually at delraywatch.com here, and if you're not familiar, we buy, sell, trade pre-owned watches, and now maybe dipping our toes into a different segment of the industry, but keep an eye out for that. We had a very special watch come in the door, and this is a watch from a brand that I thought I would never, ever have again. And if you watch the channel, you know that I'm not the biggest fan of Hublot. Yes, that's right. I said it. Hublot watches. Now I've owned some. I think it was the Classic Fusion. Yeah, the Classic Fusion, the black dial. When it came out a long time ago, I owned one of those, but I didn't have it in my collection very long. And just on my wrist today, a watch that I saw when this came out a few years ago, the Opus X, which is a cigar brand by Fuente. Beautiful tobacco dial chronograph by Hublot. This is a watch that when this came out, I said, if I ever put one of these Hublot watches on my wrist again, it's going to have to be this one. And it's really been the only one that has ever really appealed to me too much. And it is truly unique. It commemorates the Forbidden line that they released not too long ago in our distant past. And it speaks to me on so many different ways. I think that a lot of Hublot partnerships have really failed in the past, and collaborations were really kind of half-assed, I would say. Excuse the language, but this one just knocks it out of the park with the dial. Make sure at least to check it out at delraywatch.com because the dial is, especially if you're a cigar guy, it's something that is really unexplainable. It grabs you a certain way. Check it out. I'll say I don't want to talk too much about Hublot here. I keep doing things I thought I never would. Talking about Louis Vuitton tambours in the last video, and now I'm talking about Hublot watches. What has the virus done to me? The COVID. Anyway, I've got a list here of all the brands. I'm going to go through major brands here and sprinkle some others in between and talk about some of the stereotypes and not only just stereotypes, kind of the trends I see of people that are actually buying these watches or having these watches in their collection that I've experienced at Del Rey. So right away, A. Lange&Söhne. Now, of course, this is a German brand, and it's a brand that holds the quality to an absolute excellence up there with Patek Philippe and any of the Holy Trinity brands, and some would say even further than that, much more in the category of high-end independents like an FP Jorn. But the collector that goes for an A. Lange&Söhne is typically someone that doesn't necessarily have to have a brand screaming off of his wrist like Patek Philippe has become, or like a Rolex, but it's a guy that really favors the engineering and the quality. I know a lot of high-end engineers that own their own businesses that favor A. Lange&Söhne, as well as hardcore watch movement buffs, and typically these are more reserved gentlemen. These are people that enjoy wine and art and things like that. A lot of times I see them being Porsche 911 drivers, but typically A. Lange&Söhne are gents that really do favor the finest things, but only the finest things based on quality and not necessarily the flashiest brands. So that's that. Next we have Alain Silberstein. Now this is a bit of a silly one, but typically the guy that buys Alain Silberstein is a guy that is just looking for something that's a little bit unique, a little bit eccentric, and sometimes they're Jewish because this man, this creator of the brand, now dead brand, was Jewish, and he put a lot of Hebrew themes and Judaic themes inside of his watches, and there's a lot of symbolism and religion in some of the watches. Perhaps that's why the brand didn't continue into the future, but nonetheless, that's typically the guy that likes this, and sometimes an artsy guy will add one of these to his collection as well. Anonimo. Anonimo is a brand that looks a lot like Panerai. Typically you get, and the price points are much, much lower, a fraction of the price, and typically you see someone getting into an Anonimo that likes the Panerai lifestyle, the kind of that larger, much circular shape, bigger, chunkier watch, but maybe they're not willing or they're not able to kind of jump into the Panerai category. Still great watches, but that's kind of the stereotype there. Next, we have ball watches. Now, ball watches tend to draw sportier guys, more rugged, durable, outdoorsy type guys. I think it's probably because of the lume that's in the watches, but also guys that are looking for great value, because ball watches really are undervalued compared to some of the other more popular brands, spec for spec, on the same level as Ball, but Ball brings great deals. So not a clear stereotype there, but nonetheless, they tend to be sportier guys that go outdoors a little bit more, and watches that truly are worn every day and not afraid to be beat up too much because of the more approachable price points, especially pre-owned. And that's what we focus on here. Next, I have Bell & Ross. Now, Bell & Ross is a weird brand in that they do make some watches that attract the attention of watch geeks and buffs and collectors like us, but sometimes you get casual buyers, and a lot of times they're casual buyers, and it's, once again, a rugged, durable, sporty kind of guy that also has a little bit of a fashion sense about them. Seems to be the type of people that buy the Bell & Ross watches, especially now with some of their more flamboyant, or I don't want to say totally flamboyant, but more artistically themed watches. They've brought in the scope out of just using black and gray into other colors and things like that. So the Bell & Ross guy, sometimes they're even more European. I do see more Europeans buying the Bell & Ross. Just something I've noticed, but not a clear stereotype per se. Next, we have Beauvais. Now, there are very few people that purchase Beauvais comparatively when looking at other brands. Beauvais makes very high-end watches, but I really only see Beauvais in the wild on larger, wealthier Russian guys that have either come to the United States on vacation, or they're just here for whatever reason. Now, it could just be where I live in Miami, but I'm just saying that tends to be the type of person that's wearing the Beauvais. I think they're more popular in that part of the world compared to some place like the United States, or maybe, Western Europe. But Eastern Europe tends to be the Beauvais buyers. Quality watches. Some of the watches are quite expensive for what you get, but nonetheless, that's who I see with these watches. Next, we have Breitling. Now, Breitling watches are always guys that like planes. Now, there might be some other guys, but generally speaking, the stereotype is guys that like planes, and Breitling makes aeronautical chronographs, among many other things, but that's what they're known for. And up until recent times, really, you must have liked planes to have a Breitling, or you got a great deal. But generally, that's the stereotype for Breitling buyers. And once again, I'll just reiterate this. This is just stereotype stuff. We can kind of find it interesting and laugh and enjoy the conversation, but I'm not saying necessarily anything bad or great about anybody that buys any particular watch, because once again, we all like different things. These are just things I've noticed, as well as some injection of what the general industry stereotype is. Next, what are we going to talk about? Let's talk about Cartier. Now, Cartier, typically the buyer of a Cartier, unless you're talking about some of their dive watches and things that they've recently come out with, but typically Cartier buyer is someone that's interested in timeless, classic, not necessarily someone that wants to be very showy, but they want something that will last a very long time. You have way more people buying Cartier watches that are casuals compared to true watch geeks or buffs or enthusiasts. It's more of a piece of jewelry, and they're timeless. So you do see a lot of people that don't care about the trends, more classic people purchasing the Cartier watches because they know that it will still be in style 50 years into the future, or 50 years behind if a time machine comes out. So that's kind of the Cartier buyer: timeless, classic, elegant, and luxurious, but not too much. Next, we have, what do we have here? Going through a lot. The Corum. The Corum is typically known for the bubble and the Admiral's Cup. Corum buyers do not have a clear-cut stereotype, but I do see the Admiral's Cup on a lot of people that come from Eastern Europe or Russia. I think, it might just be something with the marketing in that area, but that's typically who I see with this watch in their collection. Apparently, the brand has also begun to gain some traction in parts of Asia, but I haven't seen that, and the people that typically I've seen, including friends of mine that have the Admiral's Cup, are from Eastern Europe. So just a trend I've seen, nothing too much more about the brand. Corum what do we have? De Bethune. Now, De Bethune is an interesting one. You know, a very high-end manufacturer of some of the most beautiful watches and decorated movements I have ever seen and many people have ever seen. Now, the thing with De Bethune is they come at high price points generally. We've had a couple through the doors here, but typically the buyer of De Bethune is someone that appreciates true scarcity compared with other brands like Rolex, and also appreciates the finest in detail, as well as has some eccentric and avant-garde aspect of them as well. Typically, these people are also very much into art, and that's something you see with De Bethunes and some independents out there and some very high-end manufacturer, where the piece number is very small compared to other watches, as kind of eccentric, artsy, really into the scarcity, and also enjoys the finer things without being overly flashy. That's something as well, as, you know, while some other watches have had diamonds, though in the past, De Bethune is kind of under the radar because it just kind of looks like a funky, goofy watch, but if you know, then you know. So it's the subtle, understated people, and I've seen De Bethune wearers, while they spend $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 on a De Bethune Plus, you know, they wear shorts and a t-shirt, and so it's kind of interesting to see that they appreciate it. You know, they have the funds, but they don't need to go screaming to everyone that they do have the means to be able to afford something like this. So that's who I see for the De Bethune. What do we have next? FP Jorn. Now, FP Jorn attracts a lot of people in finance, as well as a lot of people that are engineers, but highly skilled, highly trained engineers. We're talking about engineers that design or create structures of very large malls and bridges and things like that. So very high-paid engineers. You know, I'm not an engineer, a physical engineer, a materials engineer, but, you know, an engineer that is very high-paid. I see a lot of people purchasing these FP Jorns. And the interesting thing with the finance guys that buy the FP Jorns is, while they do like quality, once again, what I've seen, while they do like quality, they enjoy the quality, they're purchasing the FP Jorns in recent times because there's a bit of a trend, right? If you don't want the boring Rolex everyone else has, you might get pushed into an FP Jorn, you start hearing about it, and maybe you like the exclusivity, so you get into the Jorn. And so it's less about the movement, more about the future brand recognition and the potential to see some upside in them, I think, and I hear and I feel from finance guys. But when we're talking about the engineers that like the Jorns, we are talking about guys that appreciate the movements and the interesting ways that the movements are designed, constructed, finished, and all of that. I have a personal friend that is an engineer with some Jorns, and that's exactly why he likes them, and it really does fit the mold quite well. And once again, these are not necessarily flashy or showy people, or so the stereotype goes, but certainly an under the radar, and when you look at the business end of the watch, it really all makes sense compared to the front end for the average person looking at a Jorn. Next we have, what do we have here? Grand Seiko. Now, Grand Seiko has gone through a few stereotypes. You know, 10 years ago or even 5 years ago, the Grand Seiko stereotype was a little bit nerdy. In fact, probably the most nerdy watch brand out there, because you had to really be into the movements, into, you know, the way that Grand Seiko carries out their production and design and their facilities and their polishing and the finishing on the cases. You had to be into all of that. And, you know, 5, 6, 7 years ago, there were not too many brands besides super ultra high-end independents that really put a lot of attention into detail into all of that, with some exceptions like some Patek watches, but nonetheless, it was a very nerdy brand. Now, going into recent times, Grand Seiko has really become more mainstream. So Grand Seiko is almost a similar type of person that might be drawn to an FP Jorn or a high-end independent, in the fact that they do admire the movement finishing, the case construction, the quality, but also they're recognizing that the brand has gained a lot of traction, and so it's become more mainstream, and it's almost like a gateway drug or an entryway into discovering the true mechanics behind the watch, because Grand Seiko did something very smart. They jumped in, they started making all these beautiful dials, and that really captivated people that didn't care too much or didn't know too much about the movements, but eventually you flip the watch over and you see what it's all about, and that kind of gets you down that trail of discovering other brands that really care about the movements. And so I see it currently as a gateway drug into something like the Jorns or the Elangunzonas and many of the others out there that really do a great job with the movements. So that's kind of where we're at. Once again, started off people thought it was very nerdy, but now it's becoming more mainstream. And I wonder where the original Grand Seikos will go, or if those collectors will stay true to the brand because they've been there a long time. I would love to hear what you think about that in the comments below. That's going to be very polarizing. Next, we have H. Moser. I love H. Moser. Great watch. We've had so many through the door. We actually just took in a Pioneer. So if you are looking for a Pioneer, I think it's the blue dial, and these don't show up all the time. It's Moser's stainless steel model that's a little bit more sportier. I believe ours is on a rubber strap. But nonetheless, the H. Moser guy is a lot like a Grand Seiko person, or perhaps, they might even be already collecting Jorns or something similar. The H. Moser buyer typically buys it for the movement, totally in-house. Everything top to bottom is completely constructed by Moser or one of their factories that they own, like when they manufacture their own hairsprings. So Moser does a great job with the movements, but typically it varies a little bit compared to Jorn, whereas Jorn's looking, a lot of buyers are looking at future values of the watches, or they might be looking to see increase in price, so they're okay with paying a premium sometimes, whereas with the Moser, they still trade considerably less pre-owned than new, or the new retail price. So you see a lot more people jumping into the Moser as a gateway or as a way to get into high-end independent manufacturers without necessarily breaking the bank. So it's kind of the best of both worlds, but the Moser, once again, a lot of times understated, and you get a lot of the feel of something like a Jorn without absolutely wrecking the bank if you're in that position. So that's kind of the Moser buyer. I like that a lot. And IWC doesn't really have a clear-cut stereotype right now. The stereotype used to be that IWC buyers were a little bit more sophisticated in some way. Perhaps they would drive a Jaguar or something like that. There are some stereotype news articles out there, I think in Forbes or Bloomberg or something, where they talk about watch brands, and I think that maybe 10 years ago that would make sense. IWC, a little bit under the radar, get into one of their Portofino models or one of their other models, and it was a little bit more under the radar, but now IWC, everyone knows about them. They push the Pilot line out the door pretty much. Everyone knows it. I don't see a clear-cut stereotype with the IWC person, but I do see IWC being a brand where someone's like, oh, that one watch out of their whole catalog really pulls me in. I think I'll pick it up. They do the Pilots thing, but I don't think that they're really known for that anymore, even though they certainly try to keep up the imagery. So that one is a huge change, I think. Also, do you have an opinion on, is there like a stereotype with IWC collectors or buyers? I don't see it here, but maybe you see it there, or maybe it is you. Would love to see it and hear it in the comments below. Next, we have JLC, Jaeger LeCoultre. Here's the thing with JLC. JLC is also very underrated, very under the cuff, very if you know, then you know type brand, though it does have a lot of credibility, and some of their models, including the Reverso, have become iconic in their own right over time. But the JLC buyer is typically someone that does put some appreciation to the long-standing history of the brand, but also quality and finishing, but not over the top. JLC watches are very nice, and I think many of them do compete with the Holy Trinity. But so a lot of times it's not up to the same level and standards, just depending on the watch, and the retail prices do reflect that. So I personally love the brand, and I think probably the next watch I'll add to my personal collection will be from JLC, and probably from when they were making the 37mm versions of the watches with closed case backs, just what I like. But nonetheless, very understated, elegant, classic watches from a brand that has managed to just carve out a little niche for themselves, and someone that appreciates that classical watchmaking heritage. So, these guys a lot of times do like wine, or perhaps they like reading certain things, or they like keeping up with the latest in international politics. So the stereotype seems to fit pretty well, but once again, brands are changing models and lineups every day, and many more people are getting into it. So JLC is changing a little bit, going a little bit more sporty, but nonetheless, these are typically more reserved guys that do appreciate the subtleties of mainstream watch brands, and do also enjoy having the heritage and not necessarily willing to jump on the bandwagon of the latest and greatest brand that comes out and promises the world. Next, what do we have? We have Omega. Yep, that's a perfect one. So we have Omega. Omega is a brand that draws in a lot of sportier, everyday wear buyers. These are people that want quality, but not necessarily have to have that Rolex name. Now, Omega's they're building quite a name and brand for themselves compared to 10 years ago. So a lot of the stereotype is changing. But the buyers that buy Omega watches right now are buying Seamasters. They're buying Speedmasters predominantly. There's some others out there, like we have some of the watches in the DeVille lineup and things that do a little bit better in Asia, as Omega has turned themselves into much more of a luxury brand name and has gained a lot more notoriety in certain parts of the world. But the main stereotype is someone that likes the specs and the functionality, because they're delivering specs on par with basically everything Rolex is today. And I've done videos where I talked about it, so I'm not just speculating. You can watch the Seamaster versus the Submariner video. The Seamaster beats the Submariner on almost every front, except for the fact that Rolex is more popular. But nonetheless, the buyer for the Omega watches, they like sports in some way, and outdoors. They like the feeling of being active in some way, and they like the quality as well. And they're not necessarily needing to have Rolex on the dial. And so while it might be an alternative to a Rolex buyer, I see it just being kind of a catch-all. Omega is great catch-all brand with, besides that, not a clear-cut stereotype anymore, in my opinion, from what I see. Next, we will talk about Rolex. Okay, Rolex watches. Now, it's safe to say what Rolex buyers typically are not. Rolex buyers are typically not the people that need to see a movement that has the best finishing, right? Rolex watches are closed case back. You're not going to be able to look at the movement. You're not going to be able to admire the finishing. The finishing on the movements are, par at best anyway, compared to some of the watches that do have a case back open, like a Jorn or like an A. Zona, or like a lot of other contemporaries as well. So the buyer for the Rolex, on one hand, is not necessarily into the movements, not necessarily into the specs or the finishings of the case, albeit these watches do have pretty good all of those things. It's typically someone that likes having that feeling of putting a Rolex on your wrist. It's undescribable, but it's similar to having a Mercedes for many people. You buy a Mercedes, there's just, at least in certain countries in the world, it's just different than having a different vehicle like an Audi, where it just doesn't have that brand recognition. And that's important for some people. And in luxury, up until recent times, until us enthusiasts have really jumped out and taken the watch industry by storm, that was pretty much luxury, is how it felt and how the brand really resonated in your mind. So that's typically a lot of Rolex buyers. Now, because so many of the watches are iconic and they all are good watches, many other people have to have a Rolex. And then we start talking about vintage, and it can go on and on and on with different people that buy Rolex. So once again, similar to Omega, but really more the quintessential catch-all brand is Rolex, where they have a little bit of something for everyone. You can get into the Cellinis, and you can get someone that likes a nice dress watch with a moon face. You can do that right now. Not that common compared to, once again, some of the other contemporaries, but Rolex is a bit of a catch-all, but you don't see the guys that are into some of the more eccentric things necessarily lining up to buy a Daytona at double retail. So interesting. But leave in the comments below. I know many people have very interesting journeys owning and then flipping and then getting back into the Rolex. And there's some famous in the watch collecting community chart somewhere that shows kind of the lifeline of a Rolex owner. You buy the Rolex, and then you get bored of it and you sell it and you come back to Rolex, and so on and so forth. Leave in the comments below if you have the link for that. It's been a while since I've seen that. Next, we have Seiko. Now, guys, don't beat me up too much for this one. And I try to tiptoe around the Seiko because I do think Seiko makes a good watch for what it is, especially the price points, even though the price points have come a bit up market, though so has the quality. But the Seiko buyer typically is someone that does like the move. Now we're talking about in the watch community. If you're looking at all Seiko buyers, yeah, probably a lot of casual buys, birthdays, graduations, Christmas presents, things like that. But in the watch community, the Seiko buyer, based on comments in previous videos, looks like they truly do know the specs of the movement. Sometimes they're willing to get a little bit down and dirty and swap out a movement. Apparently, this is a huge thing. In a video I did just a couple days ago or a week ago talking about Seiko watches, there were so many people that commented saying that they just buy a new movement and swap it in themselves. And yeah, it's not hard, but I just didn't know it was that widespread. And so these seem to be really hardcore watch enthusiasts willing to get a little bit dirty, willing to play with it a little bit, sometimes swapping out the bezel. So we're talking about really diehard watch enthusiasts that care about the movement specs and things. Perhaps, this is more of a daily wear. Some people use them truly in sports or diving casually. But generally, the Seiko person really does have a great affinity towards watches and the whole experience, and not necessarily needs to have the highest luxury brand or name on their wrist, though a staple in the watch community. So I think that's probably the best way I can describe Seiko without getting completely smashed in the face in the comments. If you're smashing anything, smash that thumbs up button. I really do appreciate that. Next, we have Ulis Nardin, or Ulis Nardin, as as Americans like myself pronounce this, and sometimes I get roasted for it, but hey, gotta pronounce it with my native language. This brand typically is seen once again on Eastern European / Russian wrists, and I have got a lot of Russian and Ukrainian friends, and they tell me the marketing there is very heavy. A lot of their family owns the watches, and they do as well. So typically here in Miami, the buyer for UN is going to be someone that likes the brand, is a little bit more sporty, but also willing to pay retail for these watches, even though they trade pre-owned a little bit more. Some of the watches, like the Maxi Marine Diver, a sportier guy that just likes a bigger watch with a cool design is typically the buyer, and once again, doesn't necessarily need to have Omega or Rolex on the dial. But typically the stereotype is, Russian or Eastern European. Next, we have Tudor. Now, Tudor stereotype in the past was kind of a cheaper alternative to Rolex, but as Tudor has built out their product lineup and offered so many things, including so many variations of the Black Bay Heritage, the chronographs, the Pepsis, everything else they're doing, with some flops along the way, including the modern rendition of the Advisor Alarm, Tudor has developed a following in their own right, and it's not necessarily cheaper Rolex buyers or someone that can't afford a Rolex. Tudor buyers currently tend to be, while it seems like less people are buying Tudor than 2 years ago, Tudor buyers tend to be someone that's into sportier, rugged, durable, well-constructed cases. Not necessarily has to have the best movements, even though Tudor has developed their own in-house production movements, but someone that does like kind of the rugged, durable, sporty aspect of the watch, and having something that is a little bit different, a little bit off the beaten path, even though it's become more on the beaten path as companies like Tourneau have pushed it just so hard. But nonetheless, a little bit more sporty, rugged, durable, and you see that in all the sponsors and the soccer players and things that Tudor has sponsored. So I think that one does it as well. And also, I've got this theory I've been working on, and by working on, I mean basically just pulling out of my head right before shooting a video a couple times per year, and that's I've kind of had the feeling that the original Panerai guys moved on to Tudor for a few reasons before Panerai released all their things like the Duet and all their other changes to the lineup. So I have this theory where the Panerai sportier guys got bored with Panerai, moved over to Tudor, and now stopped buying Tudor because they're kind of bored. But I mean, this could be coincidental, but it's a theory. Nonetheless, love to hear your comments on that below. Also, lastly, let's wrap it up with Zenith. Now, the Zenith buyer has changed over the years. The original Zenith buyer was typically someone that appreciated the more classically styled watches, even their El Primeros and their chronograph lineups, as well as their elites and their dress watches and their slimline calibers. The Zenith buyer was someone that appreciated classical watchmaking with sometimes a little bit of a sporty flair, but not a lot. And so you saw a lot of people that were more reserved. You see a lot more people that were much more stereotypically like a JLC buyer or something like a Patek Philippe buyer. But when you roll into the Zenith currently, it's become very sporty, very Hublot, very avant-garde, modern, chunkier watches, and they tend to be sportier people looking for an alternative to an Hublot that still has kind of a rich feeling and a rich watchmaking history behind it. So with something like an Hublot, it's a much newer brand, from the 90s. And they were shamed a lot for their movements, although Hublot did step it up. But with Zenith Zenith was really never shamed for their movement. They were only applauded for their movements, including the El Primero and so many other movements from them. And so when you start putting those movements into watches that are more sporty, modern, avant-garde, and start mixing that with brands like Land Rover as well as Range Rover and Swiss Beats, I think is the musician's name, it becomes much more modern, and the guy that is dipping his toes into horology or cares about that but still needs to have something chunky and fun like a G-Shock or an Hublot, he can feel comfortable wearing the Zenith. So I think that probably is where that lies. But what do you guys think? Is there anything here that maybe you think's a little bit off in your experience out there in the collecting world? Or are there any brands that you felt that I missed? And how do you think the stereotypes of those brands play out? And also, once again, guys, totally fun little video here that I've been asked to do a bunch of times, and I think I probably avoided it because I didn't. That's the thing with watches, right? You don't want to offend anyone too much because everyone has their preferences. And so if I don't like Hublot, someone out there may love this Hublot, which we have at delraywatch.com. So anyway, guys, hopefully everyone is doing well. Please do not forget to thumbs up, like, and subscribe. I do appreciate it, and we'll see you next time. You have been chatting with John P. Ciao.